familiar with, the origin of certain things that we read more so about later on in Scripture, like the Nazirite vow. We read about the Nazirite vow in chapter 6. Who are Nazirites that we're aware of? Who are Nazirites that we're familiar with and that we know? There's 3 of them. I heard Samson over here. There's 2 more. John the Baptist is another. Good. I normally forget about John. Normally Samson comes to my mind first and then somebody else. Samuel. Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist, I think, are the only ones that we read about by name. But in terms of understanding their story and who they were and what they were supposed to do as people who followed the Nazirite vow, we learn about that here in chapters like this. Not only do we learn about the Nazirite vow, we learn about the priestly blessing. This is the blessing that is on the metal slab out in the lobby that Craig did a call to worship on. The reason I was familiar with this text is because this is what the FC chorus sings when they go on tour. The last thing they sing at their concert is the Lord bless you and keep you, which are the words directly from Numbers chapter 6. So that's Numbers chapter 6, vows and blessings that we learned about. Numbers chapter 7 is a record of these offerings. The leaders of each tribe come out and they make an offering to God. Some of those, or portions of those offerings, go to the Levites, but it's literally 12 days worth of offerings that are given. And then chapter 8, which will be important for later, not only for what we're going to talk about in a moment, but even for aspects of the sermon, is the consecration of the Levites. In this text, God is setting them apart, he's blessing them, he's making them holy. We're told in the text that they're supposed to be almost treated as an offering themselves. In Numbers chapter 8 and verse 11, we're told Aaron is to present the Levites before the Lord as a presentation offering from the Israelites, so that they may perform the Lord's work. We're told even further that Israel is supposed to lay their hands on them, and that the Levites themselves are supposed to put their hands on the head of bulls. Right? And so the reason that this stuck out to me is because in terms of sermons on elementary doctrines from Hebrews 6 that have been preached before, this is part of us understanding the basics, right? The understanding the laying on of hands and the elementary doctrines that Paul brings up there. It's part of us learning the basics as Christians, kind of like in chapter 6, but also here in chapter 8. Some of the things that we read about later in the New Testament come from reading texts like this. So, last thing is going from not only instructions and records and numbers, but when we get to chapter 9, we get a bit of a transition from just information to more narrative aspects of the text. In chapter 9, we get the second Passover. God asked Israel to celebrate the Passover a second time. And one thing that stuck out to me was verses 13 through 23. Because those verses includes the activity of the cloud, the culmination of God's glory at the time that would sit in the center of the camp. We're told about what that cloud would start to do. How sometimes it would be in one place just for a morning before moving. Sometimes it would stay in one place for a month. Sometimes it was just moving throughout the day. And that Israel wouldn't go anywhere unless the cloud was guiding them or leading them there. I want us to remember that because I think that aspect also focuses on, or is an important aspect of what we're about to talk about. Last thing is chapter 10. In chapter 10, Israel is told to construct these 2 silver trumpets. And these trumpets were supposed to communicate things to the entire assembly at times. It communicated to them when the elders were to gather. It communicated when an attack was happening. It communicated when the camp was setting out or when the camp was supposed to come together. And they would also communicate different aspects of celebration. When they were celebrating, they were playing these silver trumpets. And so those are the first 10 chapters leading up to chapter 11 and 12. And I wanted us to look at it so that we're not overlooking the important things that were in those texts, but because it'll also help us focus on, or help us in terms of the conversation that we're going to have today. Sorry, that's another diagram. The last thing that we're told in chapter 10 is about how the camp of Israel went out. Another thing that I wrote down to help me in terms of understanding the text specifically talks about Dan being in the back and guarding the rear of Israel. But yeah, help me visualize what was going on. But in terms of what we read about later in the text or things that we're going to focus on today, I thought these aspects of the first 10 chapters are very helpful for us to cover. But what I wanted to focus on is Israel's murmuring. That's going to be the big thing that we're looking at today, is talking about this aspect of Israel's murmuring. So I wanted to ask us first, what is murmuring? How would you define that? Go ahead. Whining, complaining, that's good. Say that again.
Whining and complaining.
Yes, whining and complaining. Anything else?
Grumbling.
Grumbling, yes, another word that you hear a lot in terms of understanding that in the text. Michael?
It has a negative connotation.
Yeah, for sure. It's whining, complaining, speaking, but definitely with always a negative connotation, especially in Scripture.
Dissatisfaction then, right?
For sure, this aspect of being unhappy with your situation. Lorenzo?
Doesn't it mean just making a disagreeable noise?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the word barbarian coming from the sound that those type of people made that it describes. Same thing with murmuring is quite literally almost automatopoeia in the sense of what that sounded like. People in the crowd making that type of noise. Mr. Jude, you have something to say?
No, it was one of the others.
Okay, got your answer stolen. But yeah, it's the literal sound that the people would have been making. Other words is complaining, grumbling, whining. I don't know a context where it actually doesn't have a negative context. In Scripture, it seems to always be negative, but when people talk about murmuring, it tends to be pretty negative. It's speaking quietly, distantly, very indistinctly, but also could be just generally understood as a rumor or grumbling or complaining. Again, negative talk. So I think, well, we will focus on the aspects of why God doesn't like it, but why do we not like it? What makes us dislike murmuring and grumbling and complaining? Do we like mumbling and grumbling and complaining? Go ahead, Gabe.
My kids.
I was waiting on that.
There's a sense of say it to my face. Like if they turn and when they don't like something that they've been told to do, it's like if you're bold enough to challenge me on it and you have a reason, then say it. If you're just complaining, you need to hush up and do what you're told.
Right.
Like,
Okay. So there's this aspect of it that makes it almost worse through how indirect it is, how impersonal it is. That's a very good point to make. Go ahead, Mrs. Denise.
Well, to me, it implies disrespect.
Okay.
Very disrespectful.
Yeah, so there's a disrespectful aspect of it. In what sense, where would you say the disrespect comes from?
Authority.
Yeah, okay, so just like a general challenging of the authority role or position. Go ahead, Leanne.
Would self-criticism fall in that category?
Like in terms of murmuring, complaining, with our own criticism of ourselves fall in that category? I think it can. I think depending on how we go about it, it definitely can. Go ahead, Michael.
I feel like there's a lack of gratitude connected to it because for the Israelites to murmur, they're overseeing all that God has already done for them.
Right. I think as we look at this subject, we'll understand that as Christians, there isn't really a place for us to ever really murmur or complain or grumble. And I think that's specifically attached to gratitude and being satisfied and being content with our situation. Learning how to do that is what Paul says. It's something that is learned. Go ahead, Mr. Jim.
I kind of look at it as like moaning and groaning, but the worst part is they start grumbling under their breath as they're walking away.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just like, I don't want to do this because they're doing it to themselves, and they're basically, like you say, put negativity onto whatever they present to me that they don't want to do. You know, they just grumble about it until they actually complete it or whatever.
Yes, it's an action that we almost immediately associate with the Israelites. It becomes a mindset for them and a way of life. It's just what they do, which is really bad. Something I think we can learn from. Mr. Mike?
Another thing that's bad about it is it's kind of contagious. A lot of times people, you're influencing other people in a negative respect. They may have been completely content, and all of a sudden, you're right, we are getting ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
And it just spreads.
Yes, so our words have influence. And so murmuring and grumbling in that sense not only doesn't bring much use, but it causes a whole lot of trouble in terms of how it grows and how it spreads. Very good point to make. I think I've said it in class before, but the reason I relate to God's hate of complaining and grumbling and murmuring is because I don't like hangry people. People, they start to get hungry, they start to lash out. And I always get upset because I'm like, you getting mad at me is not going to make food appear any faster. Same thing with sarcasm. Where someone is upset with the situation, they start to get sarcastic, and I'm like, listen, you being indirect with your words here is not going to make this situation fix itself. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
That's kind of along the same lines of why I don't like it, is because it's superfluous, it's useless, it doesn't accomplish really anything.
Right.
Like what Kaylee was talking about, when the kids murmur, they grumble, if they're not really actively trying to say something to accomplish something, murmuring under the breath or complaining, it does absolutely nothing.
Right. It doesn't produce any, well, it doesn't do anything, and if it does do something, it doesn't do anything good. Every time we see it show up in Scripture, in Numbers specifically, bad things happen from it, every single time. Okay, let's see this in context. Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, this is our reading for the week. This is where we see the grumbling start, the murmuring start. It says, now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. When the Lord heard this, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. Okay, 2 verses. What's odd about this text? What's an odd thing that's going on here? Go ahead, Mr. Mike.
I don't know that it is odd. I mean, the Lord had a right to be angry.
Oh, yeah.
And do what he did.
Yes. I think it's worth talking about how, I mean, people are burned to death in this text, but the cause of their being burned is their complaining. And so you think about the things that people get punished for, and it's like, at least when I read the text, I was like, hey, it's not like they're murdering people here, but God killed people because of their murmuring. And that could be interpreted to some people as harsh. I think that's one odd aspect of the text, or something that's worth discussing. The other thing that sticks out to me is that we were talking about this before the class started this morning. Someone said, it was Rob who was saying, this almost feels like a repeat in terms of what we're studying and what we're looking at. He's like, Israel's complaining again, like it's what they do. We read about them doing this in Exodus. And so when we read about this happening in the wilderness in the early parts or the mid parts of Exodus, we're told that complaining was directed at Moses and directed at Aaron. What's odd in this text is that the first thing we're told is that the complaining happened openly before the Lord. That's different. And so we read, or what I want us to look at earlier was in chapter 9, we get records of what the cloud was doing. So as Christians today, I feel like one of the things that we struggle with or have a hard time with is not being able to see God. Okay, they didn't see God himself, but they had the cloud of his glory in the midst of the camp. And so with that being the case, they said, hey, we're completely cool with complaining right in front of God's glory. That's bold. But they're not thinking about that, or at least they don't care about that. They've forgotten about what happened to Nadab and Abihu, and the same thing happens to them, essentially. They've forgotten about what happens with the rebellion at Mount Sinai. It just seems like there's a lot that they just don't think about, or that they forget. It's very bold in terms of what they're doing right now in front of God. But the first thing I'm bringing up was that God kills them for this. He burns a lot of people, or brings this fire down upon the camp. And if anything, it makes it clear to us that God feels some type of way about murmuring and complaining. But I think it's worth us thinking as we're going through this text, why is that the case? We have the reasons we said for ourselves. Why does it bother God so much? So, continuing on in verse 4, the CSB says the riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. The Israelites wept again and said, who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish that we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers and melons and leeks, onions and garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing to look at but this manna. Okay, so we see the complaining in verse 4 through 6, and not only have they forgotten. One of the things I talked to someone about this morning was I don't know if these things are written literally right after each other, if there's some time in between the fire and in between this. But again, it's an example of Israel forgetting things. The fire comes down upon the camp, and then the next thing that we read is them complaining about the food. That's a really bizarre aspect or a bizarre thing to me. And the next thing that I want to point out that's bizarre about this is that one thing we notice is that Israel never complains about new stuff. They always complain about the same old things. Quite literally, when they're in the wilderness in Exodus, they complain about food and water, and God gives it to them, okay? Now we're in Numbers, and we're on to the same old thing. They're complaining about food once again, meat specifically, but they're also always looking to Egypt as an answer. They don't ever really look to anything else. They say, we should go back to Egypt. It's nothing new here. Let's continue on in verse 10, see what God and Moses is responsive to this. So in verse 10 it says, Moses heard the people, family after family, weeping at the entrance of their tents. The Lord was very angry. Moses was also provoked. So Moses asked the Lord, why have you brought such trouble on your servant? Why are you angry with me? And why do you burden me with all these people? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give birth so that you should tell me, carry them at your breast, as a nursing mother carries a baby, to the land that you swore to give their ancestors? Where can I get meat to give all these people? For they are weeping to me, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. They're too much for me. If you're going to treat me like this, please, kill me right now if I've found favor with you, and don't let me see my misery anymore. What's weird about this text? Go ahead, Miss Judy. Not the first time. The first time Moses really has this encounter, a big encounter with God, he brings God's wrath against him. We're told in the text that he's denying God so much that God's anger burns against him, much like it does with Israel at the beginning of the chapter. And so I remember reading that text as a kid and my stomach hurting because I couldn't quite imagine that. But yes, Moses is saying some pretty crazy stuff, out of line stuff to God right now. Go ahead, Leanne. It seems like Moses is complaining here too, mumbling and grumbling as well. Go ahead, Miss Carolyn. Okay. Okay. It's I think it's still bold, but I think there is a difference in terms of how I think there's a difference there in terms of how Moses is functioning and the people are functioning. But it does seem like to an extent he is grumbling, complaining here, or at least saying some really crazy stuff. I think I underlined it in the I did. Yeah, I did. There's a lot of you statements here, right? Why have you brought such trouble on your servant? Why are you angry with me? Why do you burden me with all these people? At the end here, he says, I didn't promise this land to them. You swore this land to their ancestors. It seems very accusatory. Like there's a lot of blame going towards God here. That's what Moses is doing in this situation. It made me very uncomfortable. And at least in the one of the worst things I think we see in the text is Moses is like, just kill me now. That's his response, which we know isn't okay. So I would say, yeah, it is interesting how he approaches this because it's different from the people. But I think he is wrong here. And I think furthermore, let's look at, go ahead.
Going back to Mike's point, but isn't that what happens when you start that negative energy? And that negative energy just feeds and feeds and feeds and feeds on itself and builds and builds. Moses is now just getting that negative energy. He's got no more positive, we're going to the land of our ancestors. Now it's all about what we don't have to eat.
Right. Can you blame him? Considering, yeah, all the stuff that he puts up with. But yeah, he's getting...
Negative power that you have when you start being negative.
Right, he's getting kind of wrapped up in the negativity. We are told that this response pretty much comes from the weeping that he's hearing from the people. Oh, brother. Go ahead, John.
Well, in Exodus, there's a time where God wanted to talk to the people directly. They had their murmurs, so once they heard his voice directly, don't let God talk to us again. We'll die.
Right.
So once again, he's put in the middle by them again, and they continue to groan to him, and then God gets angry at him for their groaning, so it's, I can't win.
Yeah. So there is a big disconnect between the people and God at this point, or at least the relationship is different. God speaks to God directly, and they do not because of what happened in the past. They're afraid of him. but not afraid enough to say the things that they do say now. Okay, let's look at Moses' or God's response to what's happening here. And Numbers chapter 11, starting in verse 16. Moses says these things, but God gives him what he asked for. That's one thing that we should notice. In verse 16, the Lord answers Moses, "Bring me 70 men from Israel, known to you as elders and officers of the people. Take them to the tent of the meeting and have them stand there with you. Then I will come down and I will speak with you there, and I will take some of the Spirit who is on you and put it on them. And they will help you bear the burden of the people so that you do not have to bear it by yourself." So Moses says some crazy stuff to God here. What God does is show mercy on him, right? He doesn't even really call him out for saying those things. He says, "Moses, I'm going to give you some help." That's God's response to Moses. Okay, what is God's response to the complainers? In verse 33, we're told, "While the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people, and the Lord struck them with a very severe plague. So they named that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved the meat. In Kibroth Hattaavah, the people moved on to Hazeroth and remained there." Okay, so God gives Moses what he wants, but God also gives these people what they want. They're complaining about meat. He brings in a wind that brings these quail all around the camp, about 3 feet off the ground. So they get the meat that they're asking for, but I thought it was just so, I don't know. I think this is maybe one of the places in the text that we see God having a sense of humor, in the sense that you can visualize people with the meat in their hand, like as they're biting down on it, bam, God brings down this plague upon them. And I was reading the text and I was thinking, okay, well, he brings down a plague, but at least they didn't die. And then in the next verse it says, okay, and they name this place, right, the graves where the meat eaters laid, right? So God, again, is very serious about murmuring. But like we said before, we see a difference between Moses and the people here. Haley brought this up earlier. When I read this text, I thought about Job. Because in Job, he reaches this point where he's saying, I want an answer from God. And when God shows up, he says, face me like a man. In Job 40, in verse 7, God says, get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. He says, these questions will not be rhetorical. I expect an answer. But there are also other aspects of the text, and I think Miss Carolyn was kind of alluding to this earlier, is where we get places in Scripture where people say uncomfortable things to God. And while it is uncomfy to read at the time or what they're saying, you're like, is God really going to take this? It seems on some level that God respects it. That doesn't mean we need to come to God in the way that Moses does. But I think there's the aspect, the relational sense of it, of saying, I'm going to speak to God face to face. And I want to bring this issue to you, as opposed to disrespectfully speaking it under my breath. Go ahead, Ms. Carolyn.
Well, I mean, Moses has already had a conversation sort of like this with God, when God said, I'm going to kill them all. And he said, oh, hold on.
Right.
Let's not do that.
Right.
He does talk to him one-on-one.
They have a history that he can kind of work back from. They know one another. Right. Go ahead, Mr. Nee.
Well, I was just thinking, we don't see the heart of Moses in this. We read the words and they're flat. We can assume.
Fair enough.
something. But just like with David, God can read Moses' heart. So my guess is that Moses' heart was in the right place, but as a man who had a great deal of weakness, and taking care of 1 million people and their whining and all the needs they have, he must have felt just literally crushed at this point.
Right.
So God knew both the fact that maybe this wasn't appropriate, but I bet he didn't come to God with disrespect and anger. I bet there was something going on that told God he was seriously depressed.
Yes. So I think that's a very great point to make, that we didn't know Moses' heart. And in terms of God's response to Moses, maybe it's not the way that we initially took it. From the way that the text goes back to these you statements, I've read it as very accusatory. But if you did read it with a different tone, it may not come across as disrespectful. It feels more of a defeated sense of saying, Lord, I can't do this, right? They're asking me for meat. I'm not the one who can do this. You're the one who brought these things to the people. I need you to do this. It could be understood in a different way. Go ahead, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I'm kind of struggling with how to think about this, because there's nothing that Moses says that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
Moses was sought out by God to lead the people out. He said, I don't want to do it.
Right.
but he did it anyway. After you know, and God doesn't turn back to Moses and say, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Don't you talk to me like that.
Yeah, different response than Job.
There is a sense of genuineness in the conversation going on here,
Mhm.
and a comfort level that we just don't know or understand.
Yeah.
That, you know, was being had here, so.
Yeah, I like the way you put that in terms of a comfort level that we may not know or understand. I think there is something going on here that we, in a way, do shy away from, that maybe we even should shy away from. To say, I don't know about that, but in the other sense, I think there's stuff that we can still pull from it and learn from. So we did a study on the names of God, and Yahweh being God's personal, intimate name. And the fact that he even has a personal, intimate name tells us that he's a personal God. The whole point of us looking at this is to understand who God is better, who God better is. Better understand who God is, that I may know him. So everything that we know about God is relational. He does all these things to develop a relationship with us, to be closer with us. That's the whole reason that cloud is in the center of the camp. He's saying, I want to dwell amongst you and to be with you all. He's constantly communicating that throughout Scripture, that he wants that relationship. Murmuring is the exact opposite of that. And we talked about that at the beginning of the class. It's distant and it's impersonal. Have you ever been accused of something that you didn't do, or someone doubted you in a certain way and it made you respond like, who do you think I am? Something has happened and someone doesn't think much, like they put that thing on you and you kind of think to yourself, like, do you really think that I would do something like that? Or do you really think that I'm that type of person? I don't know about you, but I've been there. Where a person has accused me of something or thought of me in a certain way, and my first response is just like, who do you think I am? Like, is that really who you think I am, the type of person that I am? And if anything, it does demonstrate maybe a lack of relationship with that person. Because if they did know me better, they would know that I'm better than this. So the Israelites murmuring is a lot like that, because they are very impersonally suggesting that God is someone who is not fit to lead them. There are things I think we should remember. Again, in answering this question, why does God hate this so much? Yes, murmuring and complaining is bad, but God is going as far as killing people in response to what to this murmuring that they're doing. Why is that the case? Things to remember. Why does God rescue Israel and bring them to where they are in the first place? In Exodus chapter 2, we're told that he does these things in response to their cries in Egypt. They're crying out for help, and their cries ascend to God, and he says, I'm going to do something about that. In Exodus chapter 6, he's explaining to Moses when Pharaoh doubles down on the slaves and tells them, okay, I'm expecting more work from you now. The Lord comes to Moses, he says, it's okay. I'm going to keep my promise that I made to you all's ancestors, to bring you to a promised land. And then finally, he tells Pharaoh his reasoning for bringing Israel out into the wilderness is for them to worship him. These are all things that God has said. Murmuring is the exact opposite of all these things. So when they do murmur and they grumble and they complain, they're suggesting or making God into a liar. They're suggesting that these things that he's promised, he's not going to back them up. And what's worse about that is the fact that God has been faithful to them all this time. There hasn't been a point where he hasn't backed up what he said. So it's unjust, and it's calling him a liar. It's making these accusations, but from a baseless place. So God hates murmuring because it's prideful, it's impersonal, it's petty, it's audacious, and like Lorenzo said earlier, it's useless. It doesn't produce anything good. Okay, let's move on to the next chapter. Chapter 12. In chapter 12, we get the rebellion of Aaron and Miriam against Moses. In Numbers 12 and verse 2, I have that on the board here. They said, does the Lord only speak through Moses? Does he not also speak through us? And here's a little scary part of that, the text. It says, and the Lord heard it. And so Aaron and Miriam, they're about to rebel against Moses, and their reasoning is, God speaks through us too. Why is this all on Moses? Some of this should be on us as well. And again, I think this is a weird thing to see in the text because they too forget about the rebellions that happened earlier and what God does in response to them. But they're also rebelling against their own brother. One of the patterns that we see in the first 10 chapters of the book, and that's why I wanted us to look at them this morning, is that we keep seeing this link between the Levites and the firstborn. In Exodus, after the rebellion at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, and he says, all of your firstborn are mine. You're supposed to redeem them. Some texts say to consecrate them. And somehow those firstborn are linked to the Levites in this text in Numbers. And so in the same sense that the firstborn are consecrated, the Levites are consecrated. The Levites, the reason Moses says they're blessed in the first place is because they are the people who put down this rebellion at Mount Sinai. God directs them in doing that. So this group that put down that rebellion, now there's a rebellion happening amongst it or within it. And again, I couldn't help but think Moses would have been in a place of saying, like, who do you think I am? I grew up with you guys. We're family. Why are you coming against me like this? They threw all that out the window. So this is what God says in response to that. I love what we read here. So in Numbers chapter 12, verse 4, we're told, suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, you three come out to the tent of meeting. So the three of them went out. I don't know about you, I immediately had a flashback to my parents of being in a separate room, and you're arguing with your sibling, and all you hear from the other room is, you guys come here, all of you, come here. And I'm like, oh no. I'm sure Aaron and Miriam and Moses had to all be thinking the same thing. Oh, we're in for it now. And okay, let's keep reading in verse 5. Oops. Keep reading in verse 5. And the Lord descended in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent, and summoned Aaron and Miriam, and when the two of them came forward, he said, listen to what I say. If there's a prophet among you from the Lord, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my household. I speak with him directly, openly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? The Lord's anger burned against them, and he left. So we see that Miriam and Aaron are very quickly humbled from what happens. What we then go on to read is that God strikes Miriam with the skin disease, and the presence of the Lord leaves. It up and leaves. So there's a couple things I want to take note of in this text. The text that I kind of teased there earlier that I didn't mean to was Numbers chapter 12 and verse 1, is that it focuses on the fact that this rebellion isn't about godly things. It may seem like that, or they may pose it like that, but that's not really what this is about. In the first verse, we're told that Miriam and Aaron were criticizing Moses because of the Cushite woman that he married, would have been from the Ethiopian area. So the reason that God is angry isn't because of the rebellion itself. What he's angry about is the fact that they are rebelling against someone that he has actually chosen. Moses is someone who is of God, who he has a relationship with. So their reasoning for this rebellion is ungodly and it's dishonest, and that's why God is upset. We mentioned this earlier in the text, or earlier in the class, but I want us to notice that every time that people start murmuring, it's the beginning of rebellion and it's the beginning of trouble. There hasn't been one time that we read in Scripture where the Israelites complained and everything was just okay. There's always something bad that comes out of it. Right, Ms. Carolyn?
I'm sorry, I got a million questions this morning.
Sure.
My version, in 8,
Okay.
it says, I speak with him face to face.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why he has such a close relationship.
Right.
We've always been told, no one has ever seen God. Well, if you're speaking face to face, I have seen you.
Mm-hmm. In some aspect, in some
Always
sense.
wondered about that.
Yes. In some aspect, or in some sense, we understand that Moses speaks with God on a level that's different than at least Israel. And that in terms of face-to-face, somehow, yes, he's intimately talking to God. And it does make things different. What makes Moses such a good mediator between God and the people. But Moses is actually the next place I want to look at in terms of what's going on in the text here, is what his response is to all of this. As we've been looking at the text, we see God's response to the people's complaining, but what is Moses' response? In Numbers chapter 11 and verse 29, this is in the text where God brings the elders to the tent of meeting and he puts his spirit upon them. They start prophesying, actually. But we're told they only do it for a temporary time, for a short amount of time. But two of them continue on prophesying. And Joshua comes to Moses and he says, Moses, stop them. And Moses' response to this is, are you jealous on my account? If only all the Lord's people were prophets and the Lord would place his spirit on them. That's his response to the events that are happening. In Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, we're told that Moses is, let's see here, he was a very humble man, more so than anyone on the face of the earth. Verse 13, we're told Moses cried out to the Lord, God, please heal her, in response to Aaron and Moses' rebellion. His immediate response is, Lord, bring healing down upon Miriam. It was much like Stephen in terms of being stoned and asking for forgiveness for those people. It's much like Jesus on the cross, in terms of being crucified and wanting the best for the people in front of him still. Just like Christ, in response to other people's sinfulness and unreasonableness, Moses stays humble, and he stays forgiven, and he stays at peace. So in the last moments that we have, again, I wanted us to look at what we learned from all this in the text. What's interesting about Israel's time in the wilderness is that Paul, and a lot of times, or at least in 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, gives us a direct application for these things. In verse 6, he says, now these things took place as examples for us, so that we will not desire evil things as they did. He goes on to say in verse 10, and don't grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroyer. So what do we learn from this? That the things in the Old Testament, or in Israel's wanting specifically, happen to be an example to us. Paul connects their grumbling to their destruction. And so I can only think that our murmuring would do the same thing. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14 is another place that Paul gives more direction about grumbling. He says, do everything without grumbling and arguing, so that you may be blameless and pure children of God who are faultless in a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you shine like stars in the world. And so while there may be this understanding, okay, when it comes to godly things, I'm not supposed to complain or grumble, Paul puts it upon everything. And he says, do everything without grumbling and arguing. At the very least, he says, when you do that, it's going to make you shine among a crooked and evil and perverted generation. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29 is something we talked about at the beginning of class. Paul writes, no foul language should come from your mouth, but only what is good for building up someone in need, so that it gives grace to those who hear. Like we said at the beginning, our words have power. They have influence. And while a lot of people don't care about words today, that being their literal reasoning, they're just words. God says that that's not the case. He says he cares about our words. Colossians tells us that our speech should be seasoned with salt. It should bring something to the table. It should have influence. Just like grumbling does and it spreads, our good words do as well. And it should be building up people. Why does God hate murmuring so much? Because it does the very opposite of that. It only creates bad and negativity, when we should be using our words to build people up. So we're in a new part of the verse, or a new book in particular, but we still talk a lot in these chapters about the Levites. It's the last note I want to leave us on. Because I think it's good to learn about the Levites, because though I'm not a Levite, we are told in 1 Peter that we are a nation of priests. So they demonstrate to me how to be a good priest, and I want to be a good one. Apparently, not murmuring and not grumbling is a really good place to start. All right. Thank you guys for your time this morning.